Well, first of all, thank you for coming. Today, of course, is the beginning of the hearings with regard to Scott Pruitt's nomination for head of the EPA. The purpose of this conference is not to focus on the environmental philosophy of Pruitt. That's well known and will be thoroughly discussed by other individuals and other groups. But it's to focus on something that is particularly troubling in terms of his management and accountability in office as a publicly elected officer. The Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma is the chief law enforcement officer for the state, but he has been, in several important regards, the chief law enforcement evader when it comes to singular responsibilities attributed to that office. Part of this was pointed out by the report of the state auditor and inspector Gary Jones, who in the report that he issued in October of this year stated that it appears management has chosen not to comply with GAO standards regarding annual inventory counts, nor the Oklahoma administrative rules requiring the annual reporting of current inventory or tangible assets. He said in his conclusion on page 3 that internal controls do not provide reasonable assurance that revenues or inventory were accurately reported in the accounting records. Now, this is for a period that goes on for about at least 5 years of the Attorney General's tenure as head of the law enforcement agency. Now, not mentioned in the auditor's report, but equally important, is the fact that there's a form called the 20I. It's from Title 74, Section 20I, and it was adopted to prevent legal expenses for the state of Oklahoma from spiraling out of control. It requires each agency, including the Attorney General's office, to seek approval, to justify the hiring of outside counsel, to have certain basic disclosures in place, including estimates about the cost of the legal expenses and why we're hiring someone outside of the state in the first place, and then file those reports. The Attorney General actually has to approve those outside hirings for himself also, but for every other agency. He's the one charged with enforcing that law. Now, he has reports for every agency except his own. He has not disclosed during the entire term of office as Attorney General who he has hired as outside legal firms, how much he has spent, why he hired those, where the money came from, what those sources are. The very purpose of the disclosures to make sure that we have accountability for tax dollars with taxpayers, the very program that he is in charge of. He's the head of this program and the responsibility, and he's ignored that. Now, you couple that with the auditor's report, and you get a very disturbing picture, because one of the things that has come to light during the early course of his nomination as EPA head is that he filed 14 lawsuits challenging the Environmental Protection Agency, and in 13 of those cases, his co-parties were companies that had made campaign contributions to him. Now, that's disturbing. That's a report from the New York Times in November the 14th of this year. He also apparently accepted money from the poultry industry after he became Attorney General, and while there was ongoing litigation against that industry, which would seem to be an obvious conflict of interest. So the question that I think we all have to be concerned about is, why are you not making disclosures, and how can you lead an agency that is entrusted with billions of dollars of resources if you will not engage in the fundamental disclosures required even at the state level? You cannot be the chief law enforcement officer and be the obstructor-in-chief at the same time. It carries along with an unfortunate pattern. Attorney General Pruitt had criticized, for instance, the Environmental Protection Agency for not timely responding to FOIA requests, the federal version of the Open Records Act. He said the EPA, by taking 5 months, was taking too long to respond. Yet the Attorney General's office and Governor Fallon's office have taken years to respond to hundreds of requests and have not responded to all of those. So what can we expect in terms of accountability? On one hand, he said 5 months is too long, but his practice and what he's done in office is the opposite of public accountability with regard to how we let people know what we're doing, how we're spending their money, and what they're accountable for. It's not a matter of political philosophy. You may think the environmental regulations are too stringent, not stringent enough, or just right. But whatever your political philosophy is, everyone, conservative or liberal, has the obligation to follow the disclosure rules that apply to the use of public funds. That money does not belong to the officer. That money belongs to the taxpayers. And you have a duty to tell the taxpayers how you're using that money, why you're using it in that fashion. We don't even know, as of this date, how much money the Attorney General has spent on outside firms. So we have a question that has to be asked. And that is, Scott Pruitt, how much money have you spent on outside firms that is taxpayer money? Scott Pruitt, why have you spent that money? What's the justification for it? Part of the explanation that you're supposed to report in the 20I forms. What are you going to do when you get to the federal office and have billions of dollars of funds? Are you going to change your accountability? Will you become responsible at that point in time, and why? Should we believe that there will be a sudden change in heart and a sudden shift in behavior from what you have done during the past 6 years that you've held public office? The Environmental Protection Agency, whatever you think about it, is the custodian of a tremendous amount of resources belonging to the citizens of this country. Those resources have to be protected, at least in terms of the money appropriated. They have to be accounted for. Scott Pruitt, before you take office, answer the questions the FBI has sent forward, and answer the question and account for how you have used our money in engaging in litigation that often seems to have a purely political purpose.
Is there any doubt in your mind that Scott Pruitt will get confirmed by the Senate? And two, what is the future of the Office of Attorney General hold right here?
Well, the second question depends on whether it gets approved, and I think there is doubt. There are going to be a lot of people who are going to look at the philosophy and say, well, we're going to side with big oil, and that's the issue that they're interested in. But you could be in favor of big oil and still want someone who is accountable, transparent, and honest holding a position like that. And I cannot believe that all of the senators would take a purely partisan view on an issue that is not partisan. The expenditure, the accountability, the financial responsibilities of officers cannot be partisan issues. It cannot be okay for the Attorney General to refuse to enforce for himself alone laws that govern transparency and disclosure of how you're spending money. So I think that can be an issue. If it were partisan politics, the politics of the environment, the Republicans have a majority, I think it'd get approved. But surely there are some Republicans who've got to be concerned about how you spend taxpayer money. I mean, that is one of the principles of the party. So no, I'm not convinced that he's going to get approved. Now, if he does get approved, it will be up to the governor to appoint a replacement. I have no idea who that person will be. Hopefully their first task will be to clean up accountability issues and disclose the expenditures that have been made, and to take care of the hundreds of open records requests that are bottlenecked in state government right now, despite the fact that the open records law is by statute declared to be an inherent important policy of the state to ensure that our citizens have knowledge about how the government's operating.
Are you asking for an investigation into where the money's gone, or just for him to come forward and show those reports?
Well, if he came forward and supplied those reports and did that on a prompt basis, then there wouldn't be a need for an investigation. But with the deficiencies that the state auditor and inspector noted in his report, unless there is a prompt disclosure, unless there's compliance with the 20I reports, then hopefully the state auditor will immediately add that to his investigation, because that wasn't covered at all in the auditor's report. And I think the auditor has an obligation himself, once that deficiency becomes known, I think it was just reported last week, or certainly within the last 10 days, to step forward and fill in the hole if the Attorney General doesn't do it voluntarily.
Any thought on the four front runners who have been, by many people, saying that they could replace Scott Pruitt if he is confirmed by the Senate?
You know, I don't think that you can speculate effectively on who the front runners will be. That's going to be Governor Fallon's decision, subject to confirmation by the state Senate. So I suspect that she is in the process of vetting people as a contingency and talking to Senate leadership, and that it would just be pure speculation on my part.
Does it require Senate confirmation?
You know, I've got to double check on that. I'm not 100% sure. I know that she appoints, and I would have assumed Senate confirmation, but I'm not certain that's required. All state vacancies, state office vacancies, are filled by the governor. She might have the unilateral power to make the appointment. I would be surprised, though, if she did not confer with the state Senate.
Is where do you move from here? If, let's just say, Scott Pruitt is confirmed by the Senate, they deny that, he's back here in Oklahoma, where do you go from here with the issues and the problems that you guys have presented today?
Well, he's got to take care of them. This has to be a rule of law state, not a rule of political partisanship. This is the kind of an issue, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, you've got to do your job. If he doesn't do his job, then we have to make him accountable for that. There are taxpayer actions that can be brought. Those, you know, the ideal way to run a government is not to file a lawsuit over every failure, but that is something that you have to do occasionally. It's something we have done in the past and are prepared to do again in the future. But the important thing is he knows there's a problem. He needs to address it. If he addresses it, then you've made, it's untimely, but at least you've made the disclosures. So we would give him a reasonable amount of time to do it, but you know, it is distressing that for 6 years, he's made every other state agency file these reports and hasn't done it himself. I mean, it's hard to believe that he does not know and did not know for that entire 6-year time period that he's a state agency just like every other state agency and has to comply with the same law they have to comply with.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.